A Raisin in the Sun research paper, The American Atheist Movement, by Michael Thomas Chiango. Honors ELA 4, April 7, 2020. The play A Raisin in the Sun, first performed in 1959, was the first American play ever written by an African-American woman, and it dealt with a lot of controversial issues at the time that were not addressed by the American public, but would foreshadow many civil rights movements of the 1960s. One of the many controversial issues touched on in the play is the role of God in American life, which was put on trial during the 1960s by the atheist celebrity Madalyn Murray O'Hair. Madalyn Murray O'Hair was the woman responsible for the Supreme Court decision to ban mandated prayer in public schools in the Abington School District v. Schlempt case in 1963, and she was also the founder of the American Atheists. O'Hair pursued the case in 1960 after her son complained that he was being harassed in school for not following prayer instruction, 1 year after A Raisin in the Sun was first performed. And in that play, the character of Beneatha had some very choice words to say about God. "Mama, you don't understand. It's all a matter of ideas, and God is one idea I don't accept. It's not important. I'm not going out and being immoral or committing crimes because I don't believe in God. I don't even think about it. It's just that I get tired of him getting credit for all the things the human race achieves through its own stubborn effort. There simply is no blasted God. There is only man, and it is him who makes miracles." The author of the play, Hansberry, herself was an atheist, and to believe such things in the 1950s was completely taboo, especially as the United States was in its fight against so-called godless communism. Christianity became even more entrenched within the black community in the 1960s when Christian organizations led the charge for equal rights for African Americans. It is very understandable, therefore, that in a time period where Christianity was so important to American citizens, that the character of Mama in the play was written to immediately slap her daughter Beneatha in the face for denouncing God in A Raisin in the Sun, page 52. Although the United States has always been a secular nation since its inception, Christianity has always played a major and oftentimes intrusive role in the culture of the nation. Just like many other long-held ideologies in America, when it finally was challenged, many people certainly had very aggressive reactions. Although the theme of God and disbelief is not a main theme in A Raisin in the Sun, the words of the character Beneatha are very significant. In fact, it is because the theme of God and disbelief is not so much a main theme that makes it so significant. The words of Beneatha to Mama about God could have easily been cut out of the play as non-essential dialogue, but they were not. When pondering this, one must consider that A Raisin in the Sun was the first American play ever written by a black woman. In an age with much more sexism and racism than exist in the country today, there was already a lot going against Hansberry's play to make it fail. However, rather than just making a standard audience-pleasing film that would reinforce traditional values, Hansberry took a lot of risks and created a play that would greatly challenge the American public at the time, and thus turn a lot of people off to it. And because of that, rather than in spite of it, Hansberry's play gained great critical acclaim and has stood the test of time as a classic of American literature. Lorraine Hansberry was a political activist and dedicated her life to making a difference in the country. She had commented that the character of Beneatha was largely a self-insert for her, and thus expressed a lot of the opinions that she herself held. Much like Hansberry, Beneatha in the play is very much so a nonconformist, refusing to submit to traditional preconceptions about black people and women, and her greatest act of defiance in the book is her denouncement of the concept of God, the only thing that ever compels her mother to commit physical violence against her. The 1950s was indeed a very powerful decade for organized religion in the United States. After the end of the Second World War and the Great Depression, both instances of great strife and turmoil for America, most Americans wanted a return to normalcy, and what was more normal and comforting than Christianity in the United States, the majority religion in the country since the colonists first arrived. Church life grew rapidly in the nation, and on a typical Sunday, over half Americans were attending church, the largest percentage in the history of the country. Between 1953 and 1957, a slew of new additions were passed, such as a prayer breakfast appearing on the White House calendar, a prayer room open in the Capitol, "In God We Trust" being added to all currency in the nation, and the words "Under God" being added to the Pledge of Allegiance. Post-war Europe, meanwhile, at the time was going through the opposite transition and becoming much less religious. Another main contributor to this Third Great Awakening of religious fervor in the nation was the Cold War and the United States' opposition to the Communist Soviet Union, an atheist state that violently suppressed the practice of religion. To challenge religion at such a time period would have been foolhardy, and many people who did were often labeled as communist traitors or allies of the devil. Yet the line, "I'm just tired of hearing about God all the time. What has he got to do with anything?" is right there on page 51 of A Raisin in the Sun, 1959. That line has far greater significance than most could ever realize. It is very important to understand the cultural perceptions about atheism that existed at the time period that the American atheist movement first emerged in the country. The American atheist movement that began in the 1960s does not get nearly as much attention as other civil rights movement of the counterculture era, with many people still looking back on it very negatively as an unnecessary attack on the religious character of the nation that was responsible for causing the drastic decline in religious belief in the United States, well documented by today. The persecution of non-believers and heretics has a long history within Christianity. It is ironic that a religion based off a nonconformist radical like Jesus, who taught forgiveness and nonviolence and was eventually put to death for it, became a religion of persecution after it gained power. The Roman Catholic Church attempted to violently suppress anyone who did not agree with church doctrine for a millennia, torturing people and even burning people at the stake whom it claimed as heretics in the Inquisitions. The United States was actually the first ever secular nation that was ever founded, and guaranteed the separation of church and state, with several founding fathers like Thomas Paine being very critical of literalist Christianity. With that said, many Christians in the 1960s, and many still to this day, interpreted the freedom of religion clause in the First Amendment as only the freedom to be religious, particularly the freedom to be Christian, and to not be Christian was seen as a betrayal of American values. Madalyn Murray O'Hair and her family were targeted by violence from Christian civilians and police and regularly received death threats for her dissenting beliefs. During the 3-year process of working her case to the Supreme Court, her house was vandalized, her father died of a heart attack from the stress, she lost her job, and her son Bill was regularly abused by kids at school and derided by the teachers, and her son Garth's cat was killed by the neighborhood kids. Madalyn Murray O'Hair was steadfast in her convictions, though, and never stopped fighting to uphold freedom of speech, secular government, and education, and took on many more lawsuits challenging perceived unconstitutional religious intrusion into public life after the Abington School District v. Schempp case in 1963. Martin Luther King Jr. is now seen as a famous American champion of civil rights, while Madalyn Murray O'Hair today is either forgotten or looked at with scorn by many Americans. This is no doubt due in part to religious bigotry and intolerance, but also possibly due to the fact that Madalyn had an extremely abrasive and antagonistic personality, not simply challenging Christian dominance, but also openly and relentlessly mocking Christians for their beliefs. This was due in part to her strategy of being an intentional provocateur, similar to the LaVeyan Satanists that appeared in the 1960s, and did not believe in or worship the devil, but used Satanism to aggressively ridicule Christian beliefs. However, people who knew her when she was alive also describe her as an incredibly difficult and unpleasant person to deal with. Disregarding any personal vices, however, there is no doubt that Madalyn Murray O'Hair was a very important civil rights figure, and not just for religious freedom either. Both Madalyn Murray O'Hair and the author of A Raisin in the Sun, Lorraine Hansberry, have some striking similarities to each other, both being female, nonconformist, feminist atheists who fought for civil rights for women, African Americans, and gay people. To have Madalyn herself sum up her feelings on her mocking nature towards Christians, "I'll tell you what you did with atheists for 1,500 years. You outlawed them from the universities or any teaching careers, besmirched their reputations, banned or burned their books or any writings of any kind, drove them into exile, humiliated them, seized their properties, arrested them for blasphemy, dehumanized them with beatings and exquisite torture, gouged out their eyes, slit their throats, stretched, crushed, or broke their limbs, tore off their breasts if they were women, crushed their scrotums if they were men, imprisoned them, stabbed them, disemboweled them, hung them, burned them alive. And you have the nerve to complain to me that I laugh at you. The 1950s era, when Lorraine Hansberry wrote A Raisin in the Sun, was largely a time of great contradictions. During this time, Americans celebrated their freedom and felt very confident in their country after the uncontested victory of the United States in the Second World War. However, the Second Red Scare was still very terrifying for many Americans, and paranoia was high in the 1980s, with the McCarthy trials demonstrating the fear that any dissenter in the nation might be a communist spy. Thus, in an ironic turn of events, the United States made an effort to show that it was not like the authoritarian, conformist Soviet state by pressuring its citizens to conform to certain conservative values. Every citizen was expected to dress in a certain way, traditional gender roles were reinforced, and anything that challenged the status quo was largely looked down upon. And no matter what, God the Father was never to be questioned. This type of conformist culture has been described by many as American fascism. There were of course many atheists like Hansberry and other non-religious people during the time period, as there have been since the inception of the United States, but there really were not any major forces of opposition to religious traditions during the decade. The 1960s, however, were a much different story. The counterculture began, which was dedicated to questioning the traditional values of the country, and was seen by many older citizens as the beginning of the destruction of moral values in the United States, and was looked upon with utter contempt by the silent majority. This contempt for change and the questioning of long-held ideas stemmed out of the mistaken idea that traditional values are correct simply because they are traditional, and thus do not warrant any questioning or change. Of course, Americans now have the advantage of being able to look back in hindsight at the civil rights and countercultural movements and realize that they were obviously positive things that made legitimate changes for the better to create a more just and less bigoted society than in decades past. Granted, bigotry and prejudice against historically marginalized groups still exists, but it is much less extreme than it once was. However, in regards to bigotry against non-believers, even now, there are some very disturbing statistics. 36% of Americans profess that it is necessary to believe in God to have a good morality. 49% of Americans say that they would take issue with a family member marrying an atheist, and 40% of Americans say that they would not vote for an atheist presidential candidate. To put that in perspective, only 4% of Americans wouldn't vote for a black president, 5% wouldn't vote for a Hispanic one, 6% wouldn't vote for a woman, 7% wouldn't vote for a Jew, 24% wouldn't vote for a gay person, and 34% wouldn't vote for a Muslim. There are also currently 7 states where it is illegal for an atheist to run for public office, despite that violating the Constitution. And as expected, there is not a single member of the 535 seats in Congress who is openly atheist, despite the percentage of non-religious people growing rapidly in recent decades, with 26% of Americans now professing no traditional religious belief and 4% identifying as atheist. It is clear that atheists are the most distrusted group in the United States, but with no actual justification for that fact, as despite the beliefs of many Christians, being an atheist does not indicate any inferior moral qualities whatsoever. In fact, only a mere 0.2% of the prison population in the United States actually identify as atheists. Martin Luther King, a devout Christian, stands as the most famous civil rights activist in American history and a hero to the black community. But there have also been many non-believers fighting for civil rights as well, like Hansberry and the American poet Langston Hughes, whose poem Dream Deferred inspired the title of A Raisin in the Sun, and the American women's rights activist Susan B. Anthony, to name a few. To quote Madalyn Murray O'Hair, "An atheist loves himself and his fellow man instead of God. An atheist knows that heaven is something for which we should work for now, here on earth, for all men to enjoy, rather than wait until death." To conclude on the subject of this paper, the Christian faith has been linked to the United States of America since its inception as a nation, although never formally instituted by law into the government, and the inclusion of opposition to the idea of God by Lorraine Hansberry was a very risky and bold decision, especially with how aggressive people often reacted to having their faith questioned during the time period when the play was published. While the tide of public opinion certainly seems to be shifting, and society has become generally more tolerant of atheists over time, there is still a persisting derision of non-religious people in American culture, particularly in the Deep South. This could be because of the fact that the American atheist movement of the 1960s was a fundamentally different movement than any other civil rights movement in America's history, and that is due to a factor that was pointed out by O'Hare herself. Atheists are invisible if they want to be. Atheists are not recognizable by their skin color. They are not barred from certain positions on the basis of their gender. They are not born with certain unconventional sexual orientation. No one is born an atheist. There are no atheist sacraments or rituals, no atheist places of worship. Atheism has no defined doctrine and expresses no certain belief in anything, but merely represents the lack of a belief in one particular concept. In other words, atheism is merely an idea that can be possessed by anyone of any race, political orientation, nationality, sex, or job position. It is incredibly easy to hide and suppress, and incredibly difficult to unite a group of people around. However, as evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins is quoted as saying, organizing atheists is a bit like herding cats. But even if they can't be herded, cats in sufficient numbers can make a lot of noise and cannot be ignored. Madalyn Murray O'Hare and her followers certainly made a lot of noise, and try as it might, the country was not able to ignore her and her atheist movement, or many of the influential atheist activists who came after her and exist today, still fighting for civil rights for atheists in the nation. Today, the developed world is, as a whole, much more secular than it was mere decades ago, and while atheists in the nation were once merely in the closet, or only discussing the topic of God in the environment of high intellectual philosophy, away from the general public, atheist speakers like Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett have gained international recognition from the public, and a great amount of atheist literature is easily available to the public. Perhaps that is the fundamental reason why atheists were such a despised group, and still are in many ways. Christianity, and religion in general, puts many people in very powerful positions, and gives many more people a feeling of reassurance and security in their lives. So it makes sense why the idea that no religion is actually true is terrifying for followers of those religions. Despite the uninformed paranoia of some people, you cannot actually be turned gay, for example, but anyone, no matter who they are, can become an atheist. That means that to some Christians, the existence of atheists and the free expression of what they believe poses a fundamental threat to their religion, because they could end up convincing others that Christianity is not true. To quote Madalyn Murray O'Hare, "I'll tell you why some Christians are afraid of me. They're not sure what they believe is really true. If they were sure, I wouldn't be a threat to them at all." One can only hope for a truly pluralistic future in the United States where the rights of all to believe what they want to believe without prejudice, disdain, or discrimination, with thoughtful and respectful debate, will become a reality. However, much like the women's rights movement, the black rights movement, and the gay rights movement, the American atheist civil rights movement has made much progress, but is far from over. One must only go into the comments section of a YouTube clip of the scene where the character of Mama slaps Beneatha after denouncing God in the 1961 adaptation of A Raisin in the Sun, to find many people saying in the comments that she was justified in physically abusing her daughter and forcing her to proclaim belief in God. Anti-atheist bigotry in the United States is a criminally underrepresented issue that has costed many people their jobs, their relationships, and their respect among their peers. Especially in the African American community, where Christianity is heavily intertwined with heritage, there are all too many stories of Christian families being torn apart when one of their members comes out as atheist. Some children have even been disowned by their own parents for not believing in Christianity. Though, considering Jesus Christ's original warning to his disciples in Luke 12:53, this behavior should not exactly come as much of a surprise. To quote Jesus, "Father will be divided against son, and son against father, mother against daughter, and daughter against mother, mother-in-law against daughter-in-law, and daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law." The simple fact is that atheists are normal people, just like anyone else, who are just trying to live their lives. And for many atheists who read A Raisin in the Sun, Beneatha's words to her mother have an incredible identity-affirming significance.